The Saffron Robe by Tuesday Lobsang Rampa. Read to you by BlueFriend in beautiful BC. January 2017. Chapter 5. Together we rushed down the corridor towards the infirmary's office. Together? No, not quite. The young Lama did the rushing. I followed on faltering legs. Followed because he had a grip on the front of my robe and was towing me. I muttered and grumbled to myself as much as lack of breath would permit. I get blown off the ground and onto the roof, and now everyone's pushing me around. Oh, I thought, now I'm almost believing I was blown up. Oh, I wonder what the Inmost One thought, or knew. We skittered around the corner and swept into the office. The infirmary was having Sampa. At sight of us, he paused and looked up. His mouth dropped open at seeing me again, and his hand hovered between bowl and mouth. "You again? You? What have you done this time?" The young Lama, gasping with excitement, anxiety, and lack of breath, poured out a stumbling cascade of words, almost tripping over his own tongue with the speed of his speech. "The Inmost One, he wants to see Lobsang now. What can we do?" The infirmary sighed as he put down his bowl and wiped his fingers on his robe. "He will not merely see him, but smell him, if I take him like this," the young Lama muttered agitatedly. Aye, what can we do to sweeten him?" The infirmary chuckled and then speedily became solemn as he thought of the Inmost One. "Oh, I only did it for a joke. I was trying a new ointment and he was available. It's also an ointment which can be spread on posts and walls to keep dogs off by its smell. But it is a bruise ointment too. Now let me think." The young Lama and I looked at each other in some dismay. Dog repellent? Well, it certainly made me repellent, but what to do now? So the old man had played a joke on me, had he? Well, I thought, now the joke's on him. How was he going to get rid of the smell before the Dalai Lama knew about it? He jumped to his feet and snapped his fingers with satisfaction. "Off with your robe," he commanded. I shrugged out of my robe again. The infirmary went into the side room, to emerge minutes later with a leather pail filled with sweet-smelling liquid. Pushing me over a small drain in his office, he upended the pail and poured the contents over my head. I hopped, and the stuff was astringent, and I thought my skin would peel off. Quickly grasping a rag, he swabbed my body, leaving it very pink, very smarting, but sweet-smelling. "There," he exclaimed with satisfaction, "you've been a great trouble to me. Perhaps a painful treatment will discourage you from coming back except in dire necessity." He went back into the other room and returned bearing a clean robe. "Put it on," he commanded. "We can't have you going to the Inmost One looking like a scarecrow." I dressed, itching and tingling all over. The rough material of the robe made matters worse, but the young Lama and the infirmary did not seem to mind that. "Quick, quick," said the former. "We must not waste time." He grabbed my arm and dragged me towards the door. I moved reluctantly, leaving scented, wet footprints on the floor. "Wait!" cried the infirmary. "He must have sandals." With a flurry he disappeared and then came into view carrying a pair of sandals. I thrust my feet into them and found they were large enough for a person twice my size. "Oh," I exclaimed in panic, "they're too big. I shall trip over them or lose them. I want mine." "Oh, aren't you a one?" snapped the infirmary. "Just a bundle of trouble. Always in trouble. Wait. I must get you fitted right, or you'll fall over in the presence of the Inmost One and so disgrace me." He bumbled around, fiddling and fumbling, and then produced a pair of sandals, which were more satisfactorily fitting. "Go," he exclaimed. "Don't come back here unless you're dying." He turned crossly away and continued his interrupted meal. The young Lama was panting with worry and excitement. "How shall I explain the delay?" he asked, as if I could give him the answer. We hurried along the corridor, and soon were overtaken by another young Lama. "Where have you been?" he asked in some exasperation. "The Inmost One is waiting. He doesn't like to be kept waiting." This was no time for explanations. We hurried along the corridors, climbing to the floor above, and the floor above that, and yet another floor. At last we reached a large doorway guarded by two immense proctors. Recognizing the two young Lamas, they moved aside, and we entered the private quarters of the Dalai Lama. Suddenly, the first young Lama skidded to a halt and pushed me against a wall. "Keep still," he said. "I must see that you are tidy." He looked me up and down, pulling a fold here, draping a fold there. "Turn around," he commanded, and as he eyed me carefully, hoping that I was no more untidy than the average small acolyte, I turned around with my face to the wall. Again he pulled and tugged and straightened my robe. "You are the boy with the injured legs. Well, the Inmost One knows of it. If he tells you to sit, sit as gracefully as you can. All right? Turn around." I turned, noticing that the other young Lama had gone. We stood and waited. We waited until I thought my knees would give out. All that rush, and now we wait, I thought. Why do I have to be a monk? The inner door opened, and an elderly Lama came out. The young Lama bowed and withdrew. The high official, for that is who the elderly Lama was, looked at me, looked me up and down, and asked, "Can you walk without assistance?" "Holy Master," I replied, "I can with difficulty walk." "Then come," he said, turning and slowly leading the way into another room, crossing it and coming to a corridor. At a door he knocked and entered, motioning for me to wait outside. "Your Holiness," I heard his respectful voice say, "the boy Lobsang. He does not walk well. The infirmary says that he's badly bruised and his legs are not yet healed." I could not hear the reply, but the elderly Lama came out and whispered, "Go in. While standing, bow 3 times, and then advance when so instructed. Walk slowly. Do not fall. Go in now." He gently took my arm and led me through the door, saying, "Your Holiness, the boy Lobsang," before leaving and closing the door behind me. Blinded by emotion and fright, I hesitantly bowed 3 times in what I hoped was the right direction. "Come, my boy, come and sit here," said a deep, warm voice, a voice I had heard once before during a previous visit. I looked up and saw first the Saffron Robe glowing softly in a bright shaft of sunlight which streamed through the window. The Saffron Robe. Above it, a kind but firm face, the face of one who was used to making decisions, the face of a good man, our God upon earth. He was sitting on a small platform raised from the ground. The red cushions upon which he rested contrasted with the saffron of his robe. He was in the lotus position, with his hands clasped in front of him, and his knees and feet were covered with a gold cloth. In front of him there was a low table containing just a few articles: a small bell, a charm box, a prayer wheel, and state papers. He had a mustache then, and its ends depended slightly below his chin. His face bore a benign smile, but marks of suffering were there too. Before him, to the side of the small table, 2 seat cushions were upon the floor. To these he motioned, saying, "I know of your disability. Sit in any way comfortable." Gratefully I sat down, for all the rushing around, all the excitement, all these were having their effect upon me, and I was trembling slightly with weariness. "So," said His Holiness, "you have had some adventures. I've heard much about it. It must have been very frightening." I looked at him, at this great man so full of goodness and knowledge. Now I knew I would have to tell him what happened, for I would not deceive him. All right then, I would be expelled, cast out, driven forth for breaking the law and climbing too high. Never mind, I'd be a boat builder or a builder of kites, or... My mind boggled at the thought. I might even travel to India and become a trader. The Inmost One was looking at me hard, and I jumped in some confusion as I realized he'd been speaking to me. "Your Holiness," I said, "my guide, the Lama Dondap, has told me you are the greatest man in the world, and I cannot conceal the truth from you." I paused and swallowed. A lump had come into my throat. "Your Holiness," I said in a faint voice, "I arose early this morning and climbed—" "Lob Sang," said the Inmost One, his face glowing with pleasure. "Say no more. Tell me no more. I already know it, having been a small boy myself, oh, so very long ago." He paused and looked thoughtfully at me. "This I enjoin upon you," he said. "You are not at any time to discuss this with another. You are to remain silent upon the matter of what really did happen. Otherwise you will be expelled as the law demands." For a moment he was deep in thought, and then he added musingly, "It is good, sometimes, to have a miracle, for it strengthens the faith of the lower and weaker brothers. They need what they imagine is proof, but proof, examined closely, often proves to be but illusion, whereas the illusion for which proof was sought is truly the reality." The mid-morning sun was flooding the room with golden light. The saffron robe of the Inmost One glowed and seemed to be half flame as a whisper of wind dared to rustle its folds. The red cushions had a halo and cast ruddy reflections on the polished floor. A small prayer wheel stirred gently to the vagrant breeze, and its turquoise insets flashed little blue beams on the golden air. Almost idly, the Inmost One stretched out his hand and picked up the prayer wheel, looking at it speculatively, and put it down again. "Your guide, my brother in holiness, Mingyar Dondap, speaks very, very highly of you," said His Holiness, "and so do those who know you well. You have a great task in life, and you will be more and more in the care of your guide and of men like him, so you will be withdrawn more and more from class studies, and will have private tuition of a much higher standard. The Inmost One paused and looked at me with a smile lurking at the corner of his eyes. But you will have to continue that course of lectures with our Indian visitor, he said. That shook me. I was hoping to avoid that awful man, hoping to get out of attending the afternoon lecture on the strength of my great experience. The Inmost One continued, Your guide will return late tonight or early tomorrow morning. He will report to me. Then you will return with him to Iron Mountain to continue specialized studies. The wise men have determined your future. It will be hard, always, but the more you study now, the better will be your chances later. He nodded kindly to me and reached out his little bell. With a musical sound it rang out, summoning the elder Lama, who came hurrying in. I rose to my feet with some difficulty, bowed 3 times with disgraceful awkwardness, clutching my breast so that my bowl and other items should not fall out as previously, and withdrew backwards, almost praying that I should not trip and fall over. Outside, mopping the perspiration from my brow and steadying myself against the wall, I wondered, what next? The elder Lama smiled upon me, for I had been blessed by the Inmost One, and said kindly, Well now, boy, that was a very long interview for so small a boy. His Holiness seems pleased with you. Now it is time for you to go and eat. Go to your class for the Indian Buddhism lecture. All right, my boy, you may go. This official will see you past the guards. He smiled at me again and turned aside. The young Lama, whom I had first met, appeared round a screen and said, Come on, this way. I followed, almost tottering, thinking that this day, which was not even half over, seemed like a week already. So once again I made my way to the kitchen and begged some sampa. This time I was treated with respect, for I had been in the presence of the Inmost One, and already reports had flown that he had been pleased with me. With my meal hastily eaten and still smelling sweetly, I repaired to the classroom. Our teacher stood before his lectern again, saying, We now have the 3rd noble truth, one of the shortest and simplest of the truths. As Gautama taught, when one ceases to crave for a thing, then one ceases to have suffering connected with that thing. Suffering ceases with the complete cessation of cravings. A person who has cravings usually has cravings for another person's goods. He becomes covetous. He covets that possessed by another. He becomes infatuated with the possessions of another, and when he cannot have those things, resentment sets in, and the person dislikes the owner of the coveted goods. That gives rise to frustration, anger, and pain. If one covets a thing which one cannot have, then there is unhappiness. Actions arising from cravings lead to unhappiness. Happiness is gained when one ceases to crave, when one takes life as it comes, the good with the bad. The Indian turned over his pages, shuffled about a bit, and then said, Now we come to the 4th of the 4 Noble Truths. But the 4th of the 4 Noble Truths has been divided into 8 parts, called the Holy Eightfold Path. There are 8 steps which one can take to obtain liberation from the desires of the flesh, to obtain liberation from cravings. We'll go through them. The first is 1. The right viewpoint. As Gautama taught, one must have the right viewpoint on unhappiness. A person who feels miserable or unhappy must find out precisely why he is miserable or unhappy. He must investigate himself and find out what is the cause of this unhappiness. When a person has discovered for himself that which is causing unhappiness, then that person can do something about it to obtain the 4th of the 4 Noble Truths, which is, how can I find happiness? Before we can proceed upon life's journey with a tranquil mind and with the hope that we shall lead life as life is meant to be led, we must know what are our objectives, which brings us to step 2 of the Holy Eightfold Path. 2. Right aspiration. Everyone aspires after something. It may be mental, physical, or spiritual gain. It may be to help others. It may be only to help ourselves. But, unfortunately, humans are in very much of a mess. They're undirected, confused, unable to perceive that which they should perceive. We have to strip away all the false values, all the false words, and to see clearly that which we are and that which we should be, as well as that which we desire. We must renounce false values, which obviously lead us into unhappiness. Most people think only of I, me, and mine. Most people are too self-centered. They care not at all for the rights of others. It is essential that we look at ourselves as an object to be studied. Look at ourselves as we look at some stranger. Do you like the stranger? Would you like him to be your close friend? How would you like to have him live with you for a lifetime? Eating with him, breathing with him, sleeping with him. You have to have the right aspirations before you can make a success of life. And from this right aspiration, it follows that you must have 3 right speech. This means that a person must control his speech, must not speak idle slander, must not deal with rumor as if rumor were fact. With right speech, one should always give the other person the benefit of the doubt, and should withhold speech when speech can harm another, giving speech when speech is good, when speech can help. Speech can be more deadly than the sword. Speech can be more poisonous than the most venomous poison. Speech can destroy a nation. Thus, as one must have right speech, and right speech arises through 4. Right behavior. If one behaves in the correct way, one does not speak in an incorrect way. Thus, right behavior contributes materially to right speech and right aspirations. Right behavior means that a person does not tell lies, does not drink intoxicants, does not steal. Gautama taught that we are the result of our own thoughts. What we are now is that which our thoughts have caused us to be in the past. So if we think right now, if we behave right now, we will be right at some near future occasion. Gautama stated, hatred does not cease by hatred at any time. Hatred can only be conquered by love. He also said, let a man overcome the anger of another by love. Let him overcome the evil of another by his own good. As I was so often taught, one must not give proof of extrasensory abilities. One must not attack those who attack one. For according to the sayings of Gautama, one should not attack those who attack one with abusive language or with sticks or stones. Gautama said, if someone curses you, you must suppress all resentment and make firm determination that your mind shall not be disturbed and no angry word shall cross your lips. You will remain kind and friendly and without spite. Our Buddhist belief is of the middle way, a code of living, a code of doing to others as one would have done to oneself. The next of the Holy Eightfold Path. 5. Right livelihood. According to the teachings of Buddha, there were certain occupations which were harmful to a man, certain occupations which could not be followed by a true Buddhist. For instance, a true Buddhist would not be a butcher or the seller of poisons, nor could he be a slave trader or slave owner. A Buddhist could not partake of nor distribute liquors. The good Buddhist at Gautama's time was necessarily a man who wandered alone or lived in a monastery. 6. Right effort. Right effort has a special meaning. It means that one must proceed at one's own most suitable speed on the Holy Eightfold Path. A person who is seeking to progress should not be impatient and try to move too quickly before he has learned the lessons which are to be learned. But again, nor must that seeker try to hold back with false modesty, with false humility. A person can only progress at his own allotted speed. 7. Right mindfulness. It is the mind of man that controls man's actions. The thought is father to the deed. If you think of a thing, that's the first step to doing the thing. And some thoughts are very disharmonious. Physical desires might distract one and cause one harm. One might desire too much or too rich a food. The desire does not give one the pain, but the overeating does. Unhappiness and pain develop from excessive eating and follows the excessive desire to eat. The Buddhist must remember that feelings are short-lived, coming and going like the wind which changes at all times. Emotions are unstable things, and they cannot be relied upon. One must train oneself so that one has the right mindfulness at all times, irrespective of one's transient desires. 8. Right contemplation. As Gautama well knew, yoga was not by any means the answer to spiritual attainment. Yoga is merely a set of exercises which are designed to enable the mind to control the physical body. They're designed to subjugate the body at the mind's command. They're not designed to give one spiritual elevation. In right contemplation, one has to control irrelevant thoughts of the mind. One has to know one's own true needs. By having right contemplation, one could meditate or contemplate, so that without reasoning one could come to a conclusion by intuition as to what was right for oneself and what was wrong for oneself. The Indian teacher's voice stopped, and he seemed to jerk back into the present. His eyes roved over us and then settled on me. "You," he said, pointing with outstretched finger, I want a word with you. Come outside into the corridor." Slowly I got to my feet and made for the door. The Indian teacher followed and closed the door after him. Then he opened it again and put his head around the corner, saying, "You boys be silent, not a word from you. I shall be just outside." He shut the door again and stood with his back to it. "Now, boy," he said, "you have been to see the Dalai Lama. What did he say to you?" "Honorable Master," I exclaimed, "I am enjoined not to repeat anything that happened, not to say a word that was past." He turned on me in a fury and shouted, "I am your teacher. I command you to tell me. Did you mention me?" "I cannot tell you, sir," I said. "I can only repeat that I am forbidden to make any comment about what passed between us." "I shall report you for insolence and for disobedience, and for being in general a very unsatisfactory pupil." With that he leaned forward and hit me violently on the left side and the right side of my head. He turned and entered the classroom, his face flaming with temper. I followed and resumed my place. The Indian teacher returned to his lectern, and he then picked up his papers. He opened his mouth at the same instant as the Lama entered. "Honored sir," said the Lama to the Indian teacher, "I have to ask you to go to the Lord Abbot, and I am instructed to continue with this lecture. If you will please indicate the point with which you have reached, I shall be glad to continue." Sullenly, the Indian teacher gave a rough summary of the position and said that he was about to deal with nirvana. And then he said, "It gives me much pleasure that I shall be leaving you your class, and I hope my pleasure may be increased by not returning to it." With that he swirled all his papers into his leather bag, snapped it shut with a vicious clank, and swept out of the room, leaving the Lama looking rather astonished at the display of temper. We smiled because we knew now that things would be better, for this fairly young Lama was still young enough to understand the feeling of boys. "You fellows, how long have you been at this lecture? Have you had food?" he asked. "Do any of you want to leave for a few moments?" We all smiled back at him and assured him that we were not anxious to leave just yet. So he nodded in a satisfied way while he went to the window and looked out for a moment or two. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The Lama, who was our new teacher, pushed aside the lectern and sat down in the lotus position in front of us, sitting on the slightly raised platform which was present at all Tibetan lecture rooms. At our meals in our dining halls we had high lecterns at which a reader either sat or stood during meals, because at all times when we ate we were read to, so that our minds should be filled with spiritual thoughts, while our stomachs became filled with sampa. It was not considered correct to eat and think of the food. It was the custom for formal lectures to be given with the lecturer standing at the lectern, and as we were quick to appreciate, the fact that our new teacher was sitting in front of us showed us that he was a different sort of man. "Well," he said, "you have just been dealing with right mindfulness, and I hope that you are in the right frame of mind, because the mind is the cause of most of man's distress. Physical desires can be very troublesome, particularly in a monastic community, particularly when the inmates are all celibate. Thus it is necessary to control the mind. to create right mindfulness. Because in creating right mindfulness, we are able to avoid the unhappiness which arises when we desire all the things which we know quite well we cannot have. You know that the Buddha always taught that men particularly were often led astray by what one might term visual impact. Men, the average man, tends to idealize women. He looked at one rather big boy and smiled as he said, "I know that a young gentleman such as you, who sometimes accompanies an older monk in the marketplace, might at times deserve to be called swivel eyes." But the Buddha taught that such things are not good for the monk, because the desire is father to the action. The thought makes one do the things which one knows to be wrong. He looked at each of us and smiled as he said, "We should take the middle way, however, and not be too good or too bad." There is a story of a certain wayfarer who was traveling along a road. Some time before he had seen a very beautiful young woman pass, and he was most anxious to make her acquaintance. Unfortunately, he had had to step aside into the bushes for a purpose which we need not discuss, and he feared that in the interval the young woman must have passed him by. He saw an old Buddhist monk coming along and stopped him, saying, "Will you tell me, honorable master, have you seen a very beautiful young woman passing this way in your travels?" The old monk looked blankly at him and replied, "A beautiful young woman? Oh, that I cannot tell you. I've been trained in right mindfulness. Therefore it is that I can only tell you that a set of bones passed me some time ago. Whether it was that of a man or woman I cannot say, for it was of no interest to me." The Lama chuckled as he said, "That is right mindfulness carried beyond all reasonable limits, carried in fact to an absurd extent. However, let us carry on with the subject, which is very, very much misunderstood." He went on to tell us that the Eightfold Path had an objective under which those who followed that path would attain a very desired end, would attain nirvana. Nirvana actually means the cessation of craving, the end of resentment and covetousness. The end of covetousness and the other lusts of the body would enable a man or woman to attain a state of bliss. Nirvana is liberation from the body, liberation from lusts and gluttonies of the flesh. It does not by any means imply the cessation of all experience, nor does it mean the cessation of all knowledge, nor the cessation of all life. It is incorrect to say that nirvana means existing in a state of nothingness. That is an error which has been perpetrated through ignorant people talking about things which they do not at all understand. Nirvana is freedom from lust, freedom from the various hungers of the flesh. Nirvana is not just blissful contemplation. It is instead a fulfillment of spiritual knowledge and liberation from all bodily desires. The state of nirvana is being in a pure state, pure so far as lack of lusts for physical things are concerned. But even when one has attained to to nirvana. That is freedom from flesh desires. One still goes on to learn spiritual things and to advance in other planes of existence. Buddhists believe in the round of becoming. They believe that mankind is born to earth, lives on earth, and then dies, and then comes back to earth in a different body, that is reborn to earth, so that lessons not learned during a past life can be assimilated. Nirvana is not a place. It's not a place that you can pin down on a map. It's a state of mind, a condition of mind. It is a condition of being thoughtful. Thoughtfulness is one of the chief virtues of a good Buddhist, while thoughtlessness is abhorred. Nirvana does not mean the loss of personal consciousness at the cessation of life upon earth. It means quite the reverse. There is also a further nirvana, which in the Indian language is called parinirvana. A good Buddhist, said our Lama teacher, is a truly happy person, a person who's concerned with helping others, a person who has thought for others. The good Buddhist does not respect or recognize the titles or castes existing in countries such as India, for a man does not attain to a state of happiness by the estate of his parents. A prince could be unhappy, while a beggar could be happy. Birth does not enable one to discover how to defeat the suffering. The state of one's parents' purse had nothing to do with it. The only way to seek liberation from unwholesome desires is by following the practical eightfold path, which gives one self-knowledge. And as one has self-knowledge, one can have lasting happiness. The Lama looked at each of us and said, I suppose you think that we Buddhists have the greatest number of followers of any religion in the world. You think we are the most important. Well, that's not correct, because at the present time only 1/5 of the population of this world are Buddhists. We have Buddhists in Thailand, Ceylon, Burma, China, Japan, Korea, Tibet, and a certain number in India. There are many forms of Buddhism, and they all spring from the same source. Wherefore, it is clear that there should not be friction between us, springing, as we do, from the same parent. We can each think in our own way. Much later in our lectures, we shall deal with the uses of religion. But for the moment, I want you to recite the refuges. The 3 refuges. I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the doctrine. I take refuge in the order. The Lama said, You boys must say that in the morning and before retiring at night. You must get it impressed upon your subconscious. You can call it a symbolization of the great renunciation which the founder of Buddhism made when he left the family palace and took up his monk's robe. You boys, he continued, will be renouncing the lures of the flesh. You will be training to be young men of good character, of good conduct, young men of pure thought, for in the days that shall come upon our country, days of sorrow, days of overshadowing evil, for terrible things shall come to pass in our beloved country. It will be necessary for young men of good character to go out into what to us is the great unknown, and to keep our culture alive. Therefore, It is that you of this generation must study and purify yourselves, for we of the older generation shall not be able to follow you. He told us, in your travels you will meet many Zen Buddhists. You'll wonder if their austerities are necessary, for to the Zen Buddhist, all those who teach and all that which teaches, such as books or scriptures, are only pointers like a finger outstretched, pointing the path that one shall take. Think of the people you've seen. Think as you look down upon our pilgrims walking around the ring road. Observe how, when some guide or gypsy points to a thing, like one of us at our windows, how a pilgrim's eyes invariably follow and look at the pointing finger, rather than the object at which it is pointed. It is a fact that the ignorant always look at the pointing finger rather than the direction that the finger indicates. This is a fact which was known to the sect of Buddhism, which became known as the Zen Buddhists. It is their belief that one can only know the truth by one's personal experience of truth. Truth cannot be known by just listening to the spoken word, nor by reading the printed page. One can only profit by actual personal experiences. One is enjoined to read, to study the scriptures, and to listen with attention to the learned lectures of wise men. But all the printed words and all the written words must serve merely as fuel for the workings of one's own mind, so that when one gets an experience, one can relate that experience to great truths as propounded by others. He smiled and said, all this means that you cannot get far by being a mere theorist. You have to be a practical man as well as a student of the written word. It is stated that one picture is worth more than 1,000 words, but I say that one experience is worth more than 1,000 pictures. He hesitated for a moment and turned and looked out the window. My heart leapt because I thought that perhaps he would see my guide, the Lama Mingyar, returning from the wild rose fence lamasery. But no, he just turned back to us again and said, I am going to tell you something which undoubtedly will shock you and make you think that Zen Buddhists are uncultured savages, and sacrilegious savages at that. Some time ago, in Japan, there was a very famous teacher indeed, a man who was revered for his high ideals, for his profound knowledge, and for the austere manner of his living. Students came from all over the Eastern world to bow at that master's feet and study under him. One day he was giving a very special lecture in one of the ceremonial temples, a temple adorned by many statues of the 1,000 Buddhas, statues cunningly carved from rare exotic woods. The teacher had the enthralled attention of his students, and then he paused in the middle of his lecture, and his students held their breath, wondering what he was going to say, because he had, deservedly, a reputation for being very, very eccentric. As this wise man turned aside and seized the nearest of the wooden Buddhas and threw it in the fire, the students rose in shocked horror. For a moment there was a babble of conversation, protests, waving hands and scuffling feet. But the wise man stood calmly with his back to the fire, stood with his back to the blazing statue of the Buddha. When the commotion had ceased, he said that everyone had statues in their minds. Everyone sets up ornaments, idols, useless things which occupy space in the mind just as useless wooden idols occupy space in a temple. As he said, the only way to progress is to burn up the clutter in one's mind, destroy that which impedes progress. The great teacher turned and rubbed a finger over one of the higher Buddhas. He turned back to the class and said, "Here there be dust upon a Buddha, but that is not so bad as dust upon the mind. Let us destroy carved images. Let us destroy false ideas that live within us, for unless one clears out one's untidy mind, as one clears out an untidy attic, one cannot progress and go on to the higher reaches of the path." Our Lama teacher laughed outright at our shocked expressions. He said, "Oh, you are a conservative lot. Wait until you get out to some of the other lamaseries. Wait until you move among the people. You'll find that some have no use for the teachings of religion, and you will find yet others who wash out their mouth before speaking the name of Buddha. Wash their mouth so that their mouth shall be clean before uttering a sacred name." But these are extremes, those who make a fetish of it, and those who have no use for religion. Religion is a discipline which is only of use if one uses common sense, moderation, and the middle way, and then religion can solve all of one's problems. I do not know, but I suppose I must have grunted or made some sign which attracted his attention, for he hesitated a moment and then slowly came over and stood in front of me and looked down. "Lobsang," he said, "you appear to be very troubled. You've had a most trying experience today, but from your expression I am sure that there is more troubling you than that. And I am sure also that it is even more serious than that your guide has not returned and will not return this day. Tell me what it is." I wished the floor would open up and drop me all the way through, right down into one of the volcanic chambers, because I had to admit I had been thinking rather unusual things. To be quite blunt, I was heartily sick of the way I had to live, and I thought that now was the time, perhaps. Let us get it over with. "Honorable Master," I said with some trepidation, "it is true that I am dissatisfied. My mind is in conflict. My thoughts are in turmoil, for I am being driven to take a course of action which is not at all in accordance with my own desires. I have been sorely troubled, and as I sat upon the golden roof, struggling with the wind, thinking that death awaited me, I was glad, because I thought that death would bring the end of my problems." The Lama teacher looked at me with sympathy. He drew his robe around him and sat on the floor beside me, crossing his legs and settling himself in the lotus posture. "Lobsang," he said, "let us discuss this problem, and I suggest that we discuss it with this class because I have no doubt that many of the young men here are similarly troubled at some time or other. I've been at the patala a long time, and perhaps your own problems now may have been my problems in days gone by." "Honorable teacher," I replied, "I have no choice. I had to leave my wealthy home. I was driven out by my parents, who were very powerful people indeed, and I was told that I was to be trained in the priesthood. Because I came of a high family, I had to undergo more trials and tribulations than had I come from a low family. I had more to learn. I had more to suffer. My leg was burned to the bone through no fault of mine. Both my legs were broken when I was blown off the mountain in a gale. But although I can barely hobble, although I suffer constant pain, I still have to attend classes. Now, honorable teacher, I have never wanted to be a monk, but I've had no choice in what I wanted. I've been forced to do it. Religion offers me nothing. The Lama looked at me with a lot of understanding and said, "But, Labsang, these are early days. Religion will offer you a lot when you understand the workings of the middle way and the rules of this life and the life beyond. Then you will become tranquil, and you will understand much more what life really is. But at your present stage, what do you want to be?" I said, "I looked out from the golden roof and I saw the boatman on the happy river, and I thought, what a free life that is! How pleasant, just paddling backwards and forwards on a river which everyone loves, meeting interesting people, people who come from India, people who are going to China, people who are going beyond the mountains to return at some time with strange knowledge and strange artifacts. But I am a boy stuck here, subject to discipline, not able to do anything that I want to do, always having to obey orders, always having to learn things which I'm not interested, always being told that my life will be hard, but that I am working for a special purpose, that I'm going to do a special task." I stopped and wiped my brow with my sleeve and then continued, "Why do I always have to have such hardship?" The teacher put a hand on my shoulder and said, "All life is like this classroom. You come here, some of you reluctantly, some of you gladly, but you all come here to learn things, and each of you must learn at your own rate, because no teacher can force your development, for to do so would mean that you had an imperfect knowledge of the subject. You have to progress at your own rate, fast or slow, according to your own capabilities, according to your own desire for knowledge. All life is like a classroom. You come to this life as you come to this class, but when you leave this classroom in several minutes' time, it will be the same as dying to this life, dying to the classroom. Perhaps tomorrow you'll go to a different classroom, which is much the same as being reborn. Reborn in a different body, in a different condition, with different circumstances. You do not know what the teacher is going to teach you. You do not know why the teacher is going to teach you. But when, in years to come, you go out into the great world beyond our range of mountains, you will find that the things you have learned in this classroom and in other classrooms will help you enormously in ways which you cannot at present comprehend." "That is what my guide, the Lama Mingyar Dandap, always tells me," I replied, "but I still do not know how I can reconcile myself to do something which makes me unhappy." The teacher looked about to see what the other boys were doing, but the others were all intent. They were interested because it seemed that they all had problems similar to my own. We boys had all been put in lamaseries without any choice of our own. In my own case, I entered when I was 7. These boys were listening now. We were all, in fact, like people groping in total darkness, hoping for a ray of light to guide us. Our teacher continued, "You must decide what paths there are open to you. You, Lobsang, can stay here and be a monk, or you can leave and be a boatman, or a maker of kites, or travel to lands beyond the mountains, but you cannot be all of them at the same time. You must decide what you're going to be. If you're going to be a boatman, then leave this lamasery now, and think no more of this lamasery. Think no more of being a monk. Think only of being a boatman. But if you're going to be a monk, as indeed is your destiny, then forget about being a boatman. Devote the whole of your thought to being a monk. Devote the whole of your thought to studying how to be a good monk. And the more you think about being a good monk, the easier it will be for you." One of the other boys broke in, saying excitedly, "But, Honorable Master, I too had to enter a lamasery against my own wishes. I wanted to go to Nepal to live, because I think I would be happier in Nepal." Our Lama teacher looked quite serious, looked as if this was a matter of extreme importance, instead of being the idle fancies of boys who didn't know what they were talking about. He replied gravely, "But do you know the Nepalese people very well? Have you had any real experience of them besides the very few you have met? Do you know of the lower types of Nepalese people? If not, if you have not frequently been in their homes, then you cannot know if you would like them. I say that if you want to stay here in Tibet, then you should devote all your thought to Tibet. But if you want to go to Nepal, then you should leave Tibet now and go to Nepal and think no more of Tibet. For if one divides one's thoughts, one divides one's forces. We can have a good stream of thought or force, or we can have the scattered raindrops which cover a wide area but have no force. Each of you must decide what you want to do, what you want to be, and having decided, then each of you must concentrate wholeheartedly and with undivided mind on achieving what you want to be. For if you decide to go to Nepal with one half of your mind, and the other half decides to stay in Tibet, then you are in a state of indecision the whole time. You are worried the whole time, and you cannot at any time then obtain peace of mind or tranquility. That is one of the great forces of the world, one of the great laws which you must remember. Divide the enemy, and you can rule the enemy. Stay united yourself, and you can defeat a divided enemy. The enemy can well be indecision, fear, and uncertainty." We all looked at each other, and we thought how well this particular teacher understood us. It was so very much better having a man who was a man to whom we could talk, and who would talk back with us and not just at us. We thought of our Indian teacher, how supercilious he was. I said, "Honorable Master, I have a question. Why is it that some lamas are so very cruel, and others are so understanding and so kind?" The teacher smiled a little and said, "Why, Lobsang, it's rather late at night to delve into such weighty matters, but I promise you that we will deal with such things, and we will also deal with the uses and abuses of religions. But I think now we have worked long enough for one day, so let us each go about his own business." He stood up, and all the boys stood up with him. The Lama saw that I was having difficulty, so he bent over, put an arm around me, and just helped me to my feet, as easily, as calmly, as if he was used to doing it every day of his life. "Go along now, boys," he said, "otherwise you'll be stumbling and falling in the darkness of the corridors, and we don't want any more people who have temporary leg injuries." The boys all rushed away full of happiness because we had finished rather more early than usual. The Lama teacher turned to me before leaving and said, "Lobsang, your guide will be returning in the morning. I doubt if you will see him until the afternoon, or even until the evening, because he has to make a special report to the Inmost One and to the members of the Upper Council. But he has sent a message that he's thinking about you, and the Inmost One has sent a message to him saying how pleased His Holiness is with you, and Lobsang, your guide has something for you." With that he smiled, gave me a light pat on the shoulder, turned and left. I stood for a moment or two wondering why the Inmost One should be pleased with me when I was so tattered and battered, and when in the eyes of the others I had caused so much trouble. And I also wondered what my beloved guide had for me. I could hardly bear to think what he might have, because never in my life had I had any gift bestowed upon me. I turned and stumped out of the room just as the old cleaning monk entered. He greeted me in a friendly fashion and inquired most kindly about my legs. I told him that they were slowly mending, and he said, "I was cleaning in the Lama's quarters today, and I have heard them saying that you are destined for great things. I have heard them say that the Holy One is very, very pleased with you." I exchanged a few more words, helped the old man light the butter lamps, and then I went on my way, going down and down, reluctantly passing the corridor to the kitchen, and going instead into one of the minor temples. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to think, wanted to meditate on the past, and contemplate upon the future. In a lamasery, there is very little privacy for an acolyte, or more accurately, a chela, because chela is the Buddhist term. And if we ever were overcome with sorrow or problems, then the only place we could be alone was in one of the minor temples, where we could get behind one of the larger of the sacred figures, where no one would disturb us. So I went down and entered a dimly lit temple where the butter lamps were sputtering, showing that someone had got water in with the butter. The lamps were sputtering and sending up gouts of black smoke, which were leaving marks upon the walls, leaving marks on a tanka. I walked on and on, past the smouldering incense burners, and turned to my favorite statue and sat down beneath its shadow. As I sat there was a prrr, prrr, and a friendly black head butted me in the small of my back, and then great furry feet made their way onto my lap and started kneading, while the cat went on purring louder and louder. For some moments I played with the old cat, rubbing his fur, pulling his tail, and tweaking his ears, and all the time he purred louder and louder. Then suddenly, like a lamp going out, his head dropped and he fell asleep on the lap of my robe. I clasped my hands and thought of all the incidents of my life, thought of all the difficulties. I pondered about the present, thinking how easy it was for people to give one platitudes about religion, thinking how easy it was for one to say the rules of right living. But it was not so easy when one was a small boy and had just been forced into a career or vocation without the slightest inclination or desire for such a career or vocation. So thinking, I must have drifted off to sleep, sitting upright as we often did when we slept. The old cat slept, and I slept as well, and time passed us by. The lengthening shadows outside became darker and darker. The sun ran its course and disappeared. Soon over the edge of the mountains peered the face of the silver moon, and all the houses of Lhasa had little butter lamps flickering behind their windows. And I and the old cat, we slept in the shadow of the sacred figure. End of chapter 6.